The courtroom buzzed with quiet tension as Justice Samuel Alito leaned forward, eyes sharp, voice cutting. "Congresswoman Crockett," he began, "do try to keep up." A wave of murmurs passed through the gallery. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She folded her hands, her expression calm but her eyes blazing. She knew what this was, a provocation, a public dismissal dressed as judicial rhetoric. She waited just long enough for the silence to grow thick before responding. "Justice Alito," Jasmine said slowly, her voice rich and deliberate, "the Constitution you swore to uphold includes me, my intellect, my voice." The judge raised a brow, surprised at her boldness, but she wasn't done. "What I won't do is tolerate courtroom disrespect disguised as formality." A hush fell. The tension was now electric, rippling through every corner. Alito shifted in his seat. This wasn't the reaction he'd expected. Not from her. He leaned back, trying to regain control. "You're out of order, Congresswoman!" The bailiff took a half-step forward, but Jasmine didn't budge. "What's out of order is a justice weaponizing his robe to silence critique," she fired back. Her words landed with a weight that made even the stenographer pause. "If you're uncomfortable with being challenged, maybe it's not me who's out of place here." Gasps echoed from the observers. Alito's face tightened. The room waited. Would he retaliate? Dismiss her? But Jasmine stepped forward, her hands steady. Millions of Americans watch these proceedings hoping for truth, not theatrics. They don't want ego. They want justice. The judge opened his mouth, but the Congresswoman's voice didn't waver. "So let's drop the pretense and focus on the facts. If that's still what this bench stands for." The judge's gavel struck once, sharp, loud, desperate. "You will not lecture this court, Ms. Crockett." Jasmine took a breath, her voice unshaken. "I'm not lecturing. I'm reminding, because some seem to have forgotten who they serve." A few observers clapped before being silenced. Cameras flashed. The moment had become something more. Not a hearing, but a reckoning. And Jasmine stood at the center of it. Alito looked to his clerks, clearly rattled. He hadn't expected resistance. He certainly hadn't expected it to go viral before the court adjourned. But Jasmine wasn't posturing. She was channeling decades of disrespect, filtered through generations who were told to stay quiet. "Dismiss me if you want," she said, "but the truth has already been heard." And with that, she stepped back. The judge inhaled deeply. "This isn't how the law works." Jasmine gave a small smile. "Maybe not in your courtroom, but in real America, the one outside these marble walls, it's exactly how justice starts. By speaking up." The courtroom grew still. Even the opposing counsel looked uncertain. Jasmine had turned a routine hearing into a national moment, and she did it without raising her voice. Cameras captured every glance, every frown, every syllable. Alito's hands trembled slightly as he shuffled his notes. He wasn't used to this. Power, when unchallenged, becomes fragile. Jasmine stood, tall, her presence unwavering. "Do you feel that?" she asked softly. "That's silence. That's accountability, and it doesn't wait for a robe to approve." Alito avoided her gaze. She had pierced something deeper than pride. A murmur passed through the back rows again. Reporters texting furiously, spectators wide-eyed. One whispered, "She just undressed a Supreme Court justice." Another, "He looks nervous." And indeed, Alito's voice cracked as he called for a recess. But Jasmine wasn't done. "You can pause this session," she said, "but you can't pause the truth." He stood abruptly, turning away, robes swaying with agitation. As the judge walked off the bench, his face was pale. The courtroom, stunned, erupted into chatter. Some clapped, some gasped, but all of them understood what had just happened. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just defended herself. She dismantled a narrative, and she did it on record. A viral clip was already circulating. Justice Alito flees courtroom after Jasmine Crockett confrontation. The headlines wrote themselves. Outside the courtroom, Jasmine didn't speak to the press. She didn't need to. The footage spoke louder than any quote. Inside, murmurs of disbelief mixed with admiration. She held her ground. She flipped the script. Reporters raced to edit their headlines. And somewhere in chambers, Judge Alito sat, robe draped but shaken, rethinking what had just unfolded, not just in public, but in principle. The next morning, the clip had been watched millions of times. Networks ran specials. Analysts dissected every moment, the tone, the timing, the power shift. Jasmine Crockett trended globally. She was being called fearless, unshakable, a symbol. But for Jasmine, it wasn't about trendiness. It was about justice, and how, sometimes, justice needed to be demanded, even in the shadow of the Supreme Court. Meanwhile, Alito released a brief statement. Today's courtroom events should remind us of the importance of decorum. But it rang hollow. The public had seen the full exchange. They knew what decorum looked like and what power masquerading as tradition sounded like. Jasmine didn't respond publicly, choosing instead to return to her work. But her silence only amplified the resonance. In private, Alito confided in a colleague, "I didn't expect that." The colleague responded, "Maybe that's the problem." Judges weren't supposed to be untouchable, not when their behavior became personal. And Jasmine Crockett had made that crystal clear. Her confrontation wasn't about ego, it was about holding every institution, even the highest, you're accountable. By the end of the week, protesters gathered outside the court, holding signs that read, "We stand with Jasmine. Respect is a two-way street. Black women deserve dignity." It wasn't just a political moment, it was cultural, it was generational, and at the center of it was a woman who had refused to be diminished in the very house built to uphold dignity. On Capitol Hill, allies and critics alike took notice. Some praised her bravery. Others accused her of undermining judicial integrity. But the footage told its own truth. Calm, measured, firm, Jasmine had never once disrespected the process. She had simply refused to be humiliated by it. And that refusal was now a blueprint for others walking into rooms where they were never meant to speak freely. Justice Alito returned to the bench days later with noticeably more caution in his tone. In a subtle but clear shift, he chose his words carefully when addressing future witnesses and officials. The echoes of Jasmine's stance lingered. And whether he'd admit it or not, she had changed the way power responded to challenge. Even the robe couldn't silence principle. Jasmine Crockett continued her work, refusing interviews, staying focused. But her staff noticed a change. More letters of support, more requests for town halls, more people asking, "How can I stand?" Like she did? She had become a symbol without seeking it, not of defiance, but of demand. Demand for equal treatment, respect, and unapologetic presence in every room. The media tried to spin a narrative. Rising star versus supreme power. But that wasn't Jasmine's story. She wasn't rising. She had already arrived. She didn't need permission to be in the room. She had earned it. And now the system knew it too. The courtroom hadn't been shaken by shouting. It had been recentered by calm, righteous truth. Alito, once the most assertive voice in hearings, started listening more. His sharpness dulled, his gavel less frequent. Some called it humility, others called it fear. But Jasmine? She called it progress, because power that's shaken enough to think before speaking, that's power beginning to understand its place. She wasn't done. There were more hearings, more fights for fairness, more walls to dismantle. But something had shifted. Even her opponents now hesitated before crossing the line. The lesson had been learned. Jasmine Crockett would not be walked over. Not by judges, not by protocol, and not by centuries of conditioned silence. Her office began receiving calls from young women across the country. Law students, public defenders, clerks. "Thank you," they'd say, "for showing us how to speak when the system tries to mute us." Jasmine always replied the same. "You already had the voice. I just reminded you how loud it can be." When the clip was archived by the Library of Congress under significant modern political moments, even Jasmine was taken aback. But the archivist said, "This isn't just a moment, it's a turning point." And it was. Because what happened that day wasn't just courtroom drama. It was a constitutional reminder that respect must flow both ways, regardless of title. Alito's legacy was marked that day, not by scandal but by awakening. The judge known for sharp words was now remembered for being silenced by truth, a rare reversal, a necessary one. Jasmine's words played back again and again in lecture halls, in law classes, in community centers. She had sparked a necessary national reckoning. Years from now, when others stand in intimidating rooms facing powerful opposition, they will remember Jasmine. They will stand taller, speak firmer, hold the gaze of the gavel, not with fear, but with fact. And that, Jasmine knew, was the ultimate legacy, not headlines or retweets, but courage multiplied. She returned to that courtroom months later for another hearing. Alito looked up as she entered. Their eyes met. No words were exchanged, none needed. Respect now filled the space where insult once echoed. Justice, after all, is not just in rulings, it's in how the powerful treat the principled. The gallery was full again. This time the silence wasn't tension, it was reverence. Jasmine took her seat, composed as ever. The weight of her presence now undeniable. The judge cleared his throat to begin, but not before nodding. Not approval, but acknowledgement. The kind earned, not granted, and so the hearing began. Another chapter, another battle. But Jasmine Crockett had already won something far greater, the affirmation that no title, no robe, no chamber could define her worth. She had looked power in the eye and made it blink. History would remember the moment not for its confrontation, but for its clarity. A courtroom, once known for silence, had been changed by a voice that refused to lower, and every young woman watching now had a blueprint. As she walked out that day, cameras didn't chase. They followed, respectfully, quietly. She was no longer just a witness. She was the standard. And as the courthouse doors closed behind her, the world outside buzzed not with controversy, but with something far rarer: hope.